them went home while Jesus went to the Mount of Olives. Early in the morning, he came again to the temple. All the people came to him, and he sat down and began to teach them. The scribes and the Pharisees brought a woman who had been caught in adultery. And making her stand before them all, they said to him, "Teacher, this woman was caught in the very act of committing adultery. Now, in the law of Moses commanded us to stone such women. Now what do you say?" They said this to test him, so that they might have some charge to bring against him. Jesus bent down and wrote with his finger on the ground. Then they kept on questioning him. He straightened up and said to them, "Let anyone among you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her." And once again he bent down and wrote on the ground. When they heard it, they went away, one by one, beginning with the elders. And Jesus was left alone with the woman standing before him. Jesus straightened up and said to her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" She said, "No one, sir." And Jesus said, "Neither do I. Neither do I condemn you. Go away, and from now on, do not sin again." May God add blessing to the reading, teaching, hearing, and living of his holy word this day.
Thanks be to God.
For just a moment, I want you to look at the stones that are on the altar. These are a reminder of the journey that we're making, our Lenten journey, this journey of stones. So far, in the weeks that have passed, we've looked at laws or commandments that were given to Moses that were literally written in stone and were meant to last forever. And last week, we talked about the cornerstone and how Jesus should be the cornerstone of our lives. And we reminded ourselves that cornerstones are what everything else, buildings and lives, are built upon so that they last for a long time. So each week we've also been looking at how we need to acknowledge the need that we have for forgiveness in our lives, the need that we have even to repent of the things that have kept us or are keeping us from that close relationship that we want to have with God. And each week we reminded ourselves and thought about how those things that keep us from having that close relationship that we desire with God are represented with these stones that are on the altar. And then we were each asked each week to lay those things that bind us up or hold us down at the foot of the cross. And we laid those things down as representative stones. And in doing that and releasing ourselves from the burden of carrying around these heavy things in our lives, we remind ourselves, too, that we receive a renewing of our spirits when we do this. So this week, there have been more stones added to the altar. Sometimes I think back about when I was young, and one of the incidents that comes to my mind and came to my mind as I was preparing for this week's message of a time in the 4th grade when my classmates and I decided that the new girl in class had cooties. We didn't know her very well. She was just new, and she was different. She wasn't from there. She wasn't from our town, and we didn't know her, and so her difference made her stand out. And so, as kids can be, we made a game out of saying loud enough for her to hear that we needed to be careful and not get too close to her, because, you know, if she touched you or you touched her, you could get cooties. I don't know what cooties are. I didn't know what cooties were then. All I know is that they were something we didn't want. And since the new girl had them, we need to avoid her. Children can be very cruel and creative when it comes to belittling or ostracizing someone that's different. every once in a while I would catch this new girl looking at me, and I imagined that maybe she actually wasn't so bad. But rather than stand up against my friends, I went along with that. Jesus spent his entire career associating with people that others thought had cooties. He spent time with outcasts. He spent time with women and tax collectors and widows and fishermen and all the rest. These were all folks that no one else wanted to associate with. So, when the equivalent of a lynch mob got together and began to collect stones to execute an adulterous woman, Jesus is there. And you know the story was just read, how he scratches a few letters in the sand and with a few chosen words disperses the mob. Now, the gospel writer doesn't tell us what he wrote in the dust that day. But maybe it was the list of her accusers. Maybe he knew the men that were there. Maybe he added the names of every one of those men that had slept with that accused woman. And who knows, maybe there was a name or two on both of those lists. Those men that were packing stones that day were no better than the woman who had been caught in the wrong bedroom. You see, I think what Jesus wrote in the dirt that day, those dusty letters, reminded everyone, and even remind us today, that we all fall short in some way, sometime. Because we all have secrets and fears. We all have things that we don't want anyone to know, or things that we're afraid to say. And sometimes we even organize ourselves into packs of people who deceive themselves together into thinking that they are not the someones who are lost or desperate or hopeless, but someone else is. I learned at a young age that there's safety in numbers, and one of the timeless ways that we congratulate ourselves on belonging is we draw lines and boundaries, marking off the good and the bad, the righteous and the unrighteous, the saved and the damned, the cool and the uncool, those who have cooties and those that don't. And we're always very careful, of course, to locate ourselves on what we have determined is the right side of that line. I would like to think that Jesus scratched a few choice words about the Pharisees in the sand that day. And I imagine that we could look and see him as he surveys the scene. His eyes perhaps meeting each of the accuser's eyes, one by one around the circle. And then perhaps he looks then at the woman, looks her in the eye, and then back at the Pharisees, and back again to the woman. And then I see him crouching down, and with one finger he begins to write. And then he simply says, "Any of you who are without sin, start throwing stones." If this story were being told today, I think we could be the Pharisees. We could be the ones in the circle with stones in our hands. We could be those waiting to judge. And we would be aiming our stones at anyone who didn't think or act or speak or believe as we do. You know, the word Pharisees literally means people who have separated themselves. And we don't do that just because it's a good thing to do, because it certainly isn't. But we circle around together, we create groups, and are filled with pride at the fact that we're not like those people. And that we can look down upon them because, well, you know, we're the ones that are creating the circle or the line of who's to be included. And we tell ourselves we're better than them. We don't do those kinds of things. And so we have earned the right to be the ones to cast stones. That's what the Pharisees thought. And Jesus told them they were wrong. Now we also have to remember that he didn't tell the sinner that the sinner was innocent. He didn't tell the woman that what she did was all right. But he did imply that she deserved compassion and not the wrath of those that gathered to stone her that day. I wish I could tell you that I did the right thing back there in grade school. I would like to be the hero of the story and tell you that I wasn't the worst of the tormentors of that new girl in school. But sometimes, very often in fact, silence is complicity. I don't know what happened to that girl. She wasn't there but just a year. But I hope that she found a new school to go to where the kids were much nicer and where she wouldn't be the cootie girl. Jesus was the ultimate outcast. Jesus faced the ridicule of everyone. He was deserted by those that said they loved him. He was deserted by those who were his friends. But he wasn't crucified for just the righteous or even the self-righteous. But he was crucified for the outcast, for the ones that others taunted and ridiculed and belittled and ostracized. And I think if Jesus were here looking at our lives, at our workplaces, at our playgrounds, he would see the suffering of those that are thought less of. And I think he would gently encourage us in his quiet way, maybe again writing something in the sand, to encourage us that we need to see Jesus in everyone, that we need to see God's face in everyone. And if we can do that, if we can imagine that that might happen, then we will have been able to grasp something very important in concepts about the gospel message. So we might look back on those Pharisees and resent the actions that they took, and we might think, well, we were not like that. But we have carried on a tradition of judgment. We still do it today. But the story in our gospel lesson is not as much about judgment as it is about a story of compassion and forgiveness. Because all of them there that day needed that, even though it was the woman who was the focus. The stones that lay on the altar today, both real and those that you have imagined in your minds, represent some time when you have misjudged another, or when you have said unkind things to another, or when you have been inconsiderate to someone. And they also represent a time when you felt as though you were the outcast, that you were the one that was misjudged or hurt by unkind words or actions. You see, these stones represent whatever it is that is holding you down, that is weighing you down, and keeping you from knowing God's grace. So I invite you once again this week to lay the burden of the stones that represent hurt feelings, that represent you being left out, or represent some time when you've done that to someone else. I want you to lay those at the foot of the cross and remind yourselves that when you lay those stones at the foot of the cross, you receive the redeeming gift of God's love and forgiveness.